There's a moment, and I know this sounds strange, but stay with me. There's a moment right before you stop hoping when everything gets very, very quiet inside you. Not peaceful, not calm, just empty. Like someone pulled a plug somewhere deep in your chest, and all the warmth drained out so slow you didn't even notice until you were cold all the way through. I know that moment. I've lived it. And I'm going to tell you exactly what happened the day that quiet moment got shattered into 1,000 pieces by something none of us ever expected to find at the edge of the known galaxy. But let me start where it actually started. Because if I jump straight to the humans, you won't understand why they hit us the way they did. You won't understand why a species that most of the galaxy called savage and primitive, and dangerously unhinged, became the most important word in every prayer we spoke for the next 100 cycles. You have to understand what we were before they came. The Delvani were not a warrior people. I want to be clear about that from the beginning, because there are versions of this story floating around out there in the galactic record. Diplomatic rewrites, cleaned-up archives, the kind of history that gets written by whoever survived with enough power to hold a pen. And some of those versions make us sound like we were proud soldiers who got overwhelmed by superior numbers. Like we went down fighting and just needed a little help at the end. That's not what happened. We were farmers. Scholars, keepers of deep-time records, the kind of civilization that measured progress in libraries rather than warships. The Delvani had been cataloging the movements of dead stars before half the species in the Galactic Cooperative even learned to chip flint. We were old. We were gentle. And we were completely, catastrophically unprepared for what the Vreth Dominion decided to do to us. I was 32 cycles old when the war started. Barely adult by Delvani reckoning, my second set of sensory filaments hadn't even fully grown in yet. I worked in the archive halls of Selveth Station, which was the largest orbital research platform in the Delvani system. 600 researchers lived and worked there. We cataloged stellar drift, atmospheric changes on inhabited worlds, migratory patterns of deep space organisms. Important work, quiet work. The kind of work you do when you assume the universe is basically orderly, and that most problems can be solved by understanding them well enough. I had a colleague named Ferris Dunaleth, full name, though she hated the formal version and would give you this look, this particular flat, patient look, if you used it. And she was the first one to notice the anomalies in the long-range sensors. Gravitational shadows where there shouldn't have been any. Mass displacement readings that didn't match any registered vessel configuration in the cooperative database. Orath, she said to me one morning, 3 years before everything ended. She pulled me over to her monitoring station with one hand and pointed at the display with the other. Look at this. I looked, I saw the readings. I understood what they meant the way you understand something intellectually before your body has caught up with the information. The brain knows, but the stomach hasn't gotten the message yet. That's a fleet, I said. That's a large fleet, she said. Her voice was very steady. Ferris was always steady. It was one of the things I depended on, honestly, without ever quite saying so. And it's not in any registry. We filed the report. We filed 17 more reports over the next 6 months as the readings got clearer. The Delvani Defense Council, which was less a military body than a committee of worried administrators who met in a very nice room and talked about things, acknowledged our data, expressed appropriate concern, and began the long process of drafting a formal diplomatic query to the Galactic Cooperative's Central Arbitration Chamber. The Vreth Dominion crossed the boundary marker into Delvani space on a morning when most of Selveth Station's research staff was in the lower observatory deck, watching a triple conjunction of our system's outer gas giants. We heard the station's alert systems go off. Most of us had never heard those sounds in our lives except during the quarterly tests. Someone, I think it was young Peth, one of the junior archivists, made a joke about it probably being a drill. It was not a drill. I'm going to skip ahead a little. Not because what happened next was boring, nothing about war is boring, though I desperately wish it were. But because if I describe every battle, every retreating fleet, every burning station and evacuated colony and diplomatic mission that ended with our ambassadors dead and floating in vacuum, we'll be here for 1,000 more pages, and you'll lose the thread of the story I'm actually trying to tell. So here's the summary: 3 years of war. Delvani forces, and I use that term loosely, because we were scientists who had repurposed research vessels and farming ships and archive tenders and tried to put weapons on them, did not have good years. We lost ground constantly. The Vreth Dominion was systematic, patient, and utterly without mercy, which was a combination we had no framework for because it simply didn't fit any model of behavior we had ever encountered in our centuries of peaceful civilization. They didn't want territory, or at least not primarily. They wanted resources. Delvani space sat on top of a phenomenon called the Pellucid Vein, a band of exotic matter deposits running through our system's asteroid fields that had formed during a very specific kind of stellar event billions of years ago. This material had properties that made it extraordinarily useful for jump drive technology. The Vreth had known about it for decades. They'd been watching us, calculating whether we were worth negotiating with or simply eliminating, and at some point they had apparently reached a conclusion. The Galactic Cooperative registered formal protests, sent mediators, issued 3 separate resolutions condemning the Vreth Dominion's actions. The Vreth Dominion ignored all of it because the Cooperative's resolutions were not backed by any enforcement mechanism and everyone involved knew it. The Cooperative was a talking body. It was very good at talking. When the Vreth pointed this out at the negotiating table, actually said it out loud to the mediator's face, the mediator apparently had no response. We were on our own. By the end of the 3rd year, we had lost 4 of our 7 inhabited worlds. The population of those worlds had not been entirely killed. The Vreth were not genocidal in the traditional sense. They simply did not care what happened to the people who were in the way of their resource extraction. Some fled. Some were relocated to labor systems. Some died in the crossfire. The numbers were... I don't say this next part lightly, and I want you to hear the weight in it. The numbers were in the tens of millions. Ferris was gone by then. She'd been on Telvari Station when it was hit. I never got confirmation of exactly what happened, which is its own particular kind of pain. The unfinished sentence your heart keeps trying to complete for the rest of your life. The remaining Delvani fleet, 42 vessels, most of them damaged, running on emergency power configurations and hope that was getting thinner by the week, had retreated to a point just beyond the outer expanse boundary marker. We were using a hollowed-out asteroid called the Refuge, which had been a fuel waypoint before the war, as our base of operations. It was cold and cramped, and the recycled air always had this slightly metallic taste that nobody ever quite got used to. There were approximately 800 of us on the Refuge. Military personnel, again, used loosely, researchers who'd ended up in the wrong place at the right time, administrators, a few civilian refugees who'd made it through various escape corridors. The youngest person on that base was a child named Cell, 4 cycles old, who had been born aboard a research vessel during an evacuation and had never actually set foot on a planet. She used to wander the corridors of the Refuge pulling a small data archive toy behind her, the kind that lights up and plays recorded star sounds, and she would stop and look up at anyone who passed her with these enormous dark eyes, and sometimes, if she decided you were trustworthy, she would show you the star sounds. I'm telling you about Cell because she matters later. Remember her. The Vreth fleet was 3 days out and coming. We knew it because our long-range sensors, one of the things we were actually very good at, even at the end, even running on backup systems and jury-rigged modifications, had picked up their approach signature. 40 ships minimum, possibly more. Our intelligence on their exact fleet composition was poor by that point because our intelligence-gathering capacity had been systematically dismantled over the past 18 months. The Council had a meeting. The kind of meeting where everyone in the room knows what the conclusion is going to be before anyone has said a single word. But you go through the motions anyway, because the going through motions is the last form of dignity available to you. Commander Vell, she was the highest-ranking military officer we had left, a slight woman with a long scar across her secondary sensory cluster that she'd gotten in the battle of the Pellucid approaches, stood at the head of the table and laid out the options. There were essentially 2. We could fight 42 ships against what was almost certainly a significantly larger and better-armed Vreth force. We would lose, but we would make them pay for it. There was some honor in that, she said, though her voice caught on the word honor in a way that made it clear she was having trouble believing it herself. Or we could attempt a final evacuation. Take whatever civilian personnel we had, load them onto the fastest vessels remaining, send them toward the outer expanse boundary with coordinates for the nearest cooperative member world. The military ships would hold the line, also a losing option, but the children would have a chance. She paused after laying this out. The room was quiet. Someone at the back said, "Is there a third option?" Commander Vell looked up. The expression on her face was not unkind, but it was very tired. "We sent our final diplomatic appeal to the Cooperative Central Chamber 6 weeks ago. We haven't received a response." "No third option, then?" "We were 3 days from the end of everything. I want to tell you what those 3 days felt like. Not the logistics. The logistics are in the archive record, if you want them, but the feeling of it, because I think that's actually the important part. The part that explains why what came next hit us the way it did. The refuge was a dark place even on normal days. Asteroid rock doesn't let much light in. But in those 3 days before the Vreth arrived, it got darker in a different way. The kind of darkness that isn't about light at all. People still did their jobs. That's the thing that gets me even now. Everyone still did their jobs. The engineers kept the life support running. The cooks, we had exactly 2 people responsible for feeding 800, kept making food, such as it was. The medical staff checked their supply inventories and made quiet, private calculations about what would be most useful in what order. But the conversations were different, shorter. People talked about small things, specific memories. This food their mother used to make, that particular view from a window they'd grown up looking through. The way rain felt on a specific world that no longer had rain on it because the atmospheric processors had been destroyed in the 2nd year of the war. I walked the corridors at night. We kept a night cycle, artificial as it was, because the rhythms helped, and I listened to what people talked about. They talked about the past almost entirely. Very rarely about the future, and when they did, it was usually in very small terms. After this is over, if there's a chance, I'd like to find my sister. Just know she's somewhere safe. Not grand plans, just tiny bright possible things held carefully like something that might break. Sel, the 4-year-old, stopped showing people her Star Sounds toy around the 2nd day. One of the medics told me she'd cried herself to sleep the night before, and nobody knew exactly why. Whether she'd overheard something she shouldn't have, or just absorbed the emotional texture of the base the way children do, like sponges that pick up whatever's in the air around them. I sat with her for a while on the 2nd afternoon. We didn't talk much. She just sat against my shoulder and held her toy, and we watched the slow rotation of a distant nebula through one of the observation ports. She fell asleep like that. Her breathing was steady and small, and I sat there for longer than I should have because getting up felt like giving something up that I wouldn't get back. On the 3rd morning, our sensors picked up the lead edge of the Vreth approach fleet. 47 ships confirmed. Possibly more behind them. Sensor shadow was making it hard to tell. Commander Vell called the evacuation order. The civilian vessels started loading. And then our long-range sensors, the ones pointed in the other direction, toward the deep outer expanse, where nothing ever came from because there was nothing out there, started screaming. I was in the sensor bay when the readings came in. I was there because the senior sensor technician, a man named Dorvas, had asked me to look at an anomaly he was getting from that direction that he couldn't classify. He thought it might be interference from the Vreth approach, some kind of navigational bleed from their drive signatures. I looked at the readings. They were not navigational bleed from the Vreth drives. I have spent a long time since that day trying to find words that accurately describe what it looked like on the sensor display. The closest I can get is this. You know how, when you're in a dark room and someone opens a door to a lit hallway, there's that moment before your eyes adjust where the light almost seems to have weight, where it doesn't just illuminate but actually presses in. That's what the sensor readings looked like, not just signals, something that had weight. 17 drive signatures. No, I checked again. 22. No, I kept having to recount because the signatures were moving, changing, doing something that our sensor system was not designed to process because it wasn't in any recognition database we had. Dorvas, I said. I see it, he said. His voice was completely flat. What classification? I don't know. He was pulling up overlay after overlay on his secondary display, running the signatures through every identification algorithm we had. It's not cooperative. It's not Vreth. It's not any registered fleet in the expanse. He paused. It's not any registered fleet anywhere. The signatures were coming fast, faster than anything we had. Faster than anything we'd seen the Vreth move, and the Vreth had very good drives. faster than should have been physically comfortable for any species I was aware of operating aboard vessels. I pulled up the trajectory calculation without thinking about it, just running on professional reflex. They're going to be in sensor visual range in 4 minutes, Dorvas said. He'd done the same calculation. And then they're going to be right on top of the Vreth fleet in about 8. We stared at each other. I'm calling Commander Vel, Dorvas said. Yes, I said, you should do that. The first visual contact came through on the main sensor, array 3 minutes and 40 seconds after that conversation. I was standing in the sensor bay doorway by then, Dorvas behind me. Commander Vel having arrived with 3 of her officers and crowded into a room that was not designed for that many people. The display showed them as shape signatures at first, silhouettes in the sensor interpretation overlay, and they were wrong. Not wrong in a bad way, necessarily, just wrong in the way that things are wrong when they don't fit any category you've ever had to think in before. The vessels were large, very large, but they didn't have the smooth, almost organic curves of cooperative fleet vessels or the angular brutalist architecture of Vreth military design. They looked, and I struggled with this description for a long time afterward because it didn't make any sense to me aesthetically. They looked functional in a way that was almost aggressive about it. Like every element of their design had been chosen purely for what it could do and nothing else. No elegance, no ceremony. Just capability, stacked on top of more capability, with what appeared to be weapons systems of a kind and scale that made Dorvas actually make a small sound, not a word, just a sound, when the analysis software started estimating them. What civilization builds like that? One of Vel's officers asked. He was looking at the design analysis overlay. Commander Vel said, very quietly, run the registry search again. I've run it 4 times, Dorvas said. There's no match in the Galactic Cooperative's database. There's no match in any historical archive I can access. There's a partial flag, I said. I had spotted it, almost buried in the search result noise because I'd spent 15 years working with archive databases and I knew how to read the lower weight result signals. Low confidence, 43% match. Outer Expanse Exploration Survey, 3rd partition. What species? Vel asked. I pulled up the record. The species notation field said, Homo sapiens. Common designation, humans. Classification, developing, pre-cooperative. Status, quarantined, assessment ongoing. Last contact, 71 cycles prior. There was a note attached to the record, a notation made by the survey team that had last made contact. I read it out loud because everyone was looking at me. Exercise significant caution in any future engagement. This species demonstrates an unusual and poorly understood relationship with conflict. Threat response behavior is disproportionate, unpredictable, and does not conform to standard models. Recommend no further unsupervised contact until full behavioral assessment is complete. Note, species appears to be aware of this assessment. They did not seem pleased. The sensor room was absolutely silent for about 3 seconds. Then Commander Vel said, humans. And then the human fleet, came out of their faster-than-light transit and into full sensor range. And every screen in the sensor bay lit up at once. And one of Vel's officers said a word in Delvani that I won't repeat here because it was extremely inappropriate but also very, very accurate. That was the confirmed count, once the sensor software had a full visual lock and stopped recalculating. 22 human vessels, ranging from what appeared to be medium-sized combat ships. I'm translating the size categories roughly, because human nomenclature for their vessel classes is interesting, and I'll get to that. Up to 3 vessels that the analysis software classified as heavy, which was a category it almost never used, because heavy-class vessels were rare in this part of the galaxy and extraordinarily expensive to field. The largest of the 3 heavy vessels was almost twice the size of anything the Vreth Dominion had in their approaching fleet. I want you to hold that number in your head for a moment. The Vreth Dominion, who had spent 3 years methodically destroying a civilization that had absolutely no ability to stop them, who had 47 ships in the approaching fleet, and had faced essentially 0 meaningful opposition for the entirety of their campaign. The Vreth Dominion, who had made the galactic powers of the cooperative flinch and look away, did not have anything in their fleet the size of the human flagship. And there were 3 of those. Commander Vell was on comms immediately, trying to raise the human fleet. Standard cooperative frequencies first, nothing. Then we ran through the emergency broadcast bands, the diplomatic channels, the general hailing protocols that any space-capable civilization with cooperative contact would theoretically know. For 11 very long minutes, nothing. The humans were not answering. They were, however, doing something else. Our sensor array was tracking their fleet movement, and they were doing something that took me a moment to recognize because I had never seen it done in real time before. I'd read about it in historical military archives, which I'd worked with briefly during the first year of the war when the Defense Council had been desperately mining old records for anything useful. They were forming up, not randomly adjusting to their new position, not drifting into a defensive perimeter the way most species did when entering an uncertain situation. They were moving with clear, practiced, synchronized purpose into a specific geometric configuration, and the configuration was pointed directly at the Vreth fleet. "They know the Vreth are there," Vell said. It wasn't a question. "They must have been monitoring from outside our sensor range," Dorvas confirmed. "They knew what they were coming into." One of Vell's officers, the one who'd made the inappropriate but accurate exclamation, said, "Do they know we're here?" "If they can track the Vreth fleet from outside our range," I said slowly, working it through, "then they definitely." A new signal came through on all our communication bands simultaneously. Not a voice, not a visual. Just a data packet, compressed, in a format that our systems flagged as unfamiliar but translation compatible. It took the translation software 40 seconds to work through it. What it said, when the translation resolved, was this: Delvani Remnant Fleet. This is the Terran Expeditionary Response Force, vessel designation Turf 7. We have your distress signals from the past 3 years. We are aware of the situation. Stand clear of the engagement zone. We will handle this. And then, because the universe apparently has a sense of theatrics. P.S. We know you filed a quarantine recommendation on us. We'll talk about that later. Right now we're busy. I'm going to pause here and explain something, because I think it matters for understanding everything that follows. The Delvani had been aware of humans, barely, for about 80 cycles. They were a young species, by galactic standards. Their world was in the outer expanse, outside the formal boundaries of the galactic cooperative's established territory, and they had been assessed as a developing civilization with significant potential but also significant concerns. The concerns were, broadly, humans were strange, not in ways that were easy to categorize. They were biologically fragile compared to most space-capable species, shorter lifespans, vulnerable to a wide range of environmental factors, no natural defensive adaptations to speak of. They were smaller, on average, than most civilizations that had achieved space travel. They should not, by any reasonable metric, have been particularly threatening. But there was something in them that the survey teams had flagged repeatedly and never quite been able to explain properly. Something in the way they responded to threats. Something in the relationship between their biology, which was soft, and their behavior, which was not. One survey report I'd read years before the war had put it this way: human beings appear to have no biological capacity for true fear response shutdown. They experience fear the way other species do. They simply do not allow it to stop them. The mechanism by which they accomplish this is unclear. The result is, frankly, unsettling. Another report noted that humans, when fighting, and they had fought extensively throughout their history, mostly each other, did not fight like a species trying to survive. They fought like a species trying to win. There was a distinction there that the report writer couldn't quite articulate but kept coming back to. I thought about those reports, standing in the sensor bay of the refuge, watching the human fleet form up. And then the Vreth fleet did something interesting, something I hadn't expected. They slowed down. The Vreth Dominion fleet commander was, apparently, not an idiot. 47 ships entering a cleanup operation against 42 damaged, undersupplied, demoralized Delvani vessels is one thing. 47 ships encountering 22 unidentified vessels of unknown capability in an intercept formation is something else entirely. The Vreth were cautious. They were calculating. They hadn't built a successful military empire by charging at unknowns. So they slowed down, and they spread out into a wider formation that was both defensive and communicative. A battle posture that said we are not afraid but we are paying attention, and their fleet opened comms. What they sent was a standard galactic cooperative challenge code. The rough translation is, identify, state your affiliation, and declare your business in this sector. The human fleet's response time was approximately 4 seconds. What they sent back was also a cooperative challenge code, but a different one. A very old one, actually. The kind that hadn't been in primary use for about 300 cycles. The kind that, if you looked it up in the archive, had a specific meaning in the old diplomatic lexicon. It translated to, "We are here on behalf of those you have wronged. Prepare to answer for it." I looked at Dorvas. Dorvas looked at me. "Where did they find that code?" he asked. "I have no idea," I said. "We barely know that code exists. The humans have been in the cooperative archives." "The humans," I said slowly, "have apparently been doing a great deal of things we weren't aware of." On the sensor display, the Vreth fleet completed its defensive spread. On the other display, the human fleet's intercept formation continued to tighten. In the geometry of the two formations, there was a kind of terrible logic. Two different approaches to the same moment. One defensive and reactive, one purposeful and already looking past the present second toward the one that came after it. Commander Vel was on a comm channel I couldn't hear, talking to someone on one of the human ships. Her face was doing something complicated. Not quite fear, not quite relief. The face of someone who has been bracing for a fall for so long that when the ground stops coming toward them, the muscles don't know immediately what to do. She lowered the comm device. She looked at her officers. "They want us to move our fleet to the rear sector," she said, "behind the asteroid field. Out of the engagement zone." "Did they say why?" one of her officers asked. Vel looked at the display for a moment. "Quote," she said, "because things are about to get loud and we don't want you in the middle of it." We moved. The Delvani remnant fleet, 42 battered vessels and one asteroid base with 800 people on it, shifted position behind the primary asteroid field while the human fleet finished forming up. I watched from the refuge's sensor bay because nobody could make me leave, and also, honestly, nobody tried. Dorvas and I sat in front of the displays side by side, and we watched what happened next. The Vreth Dominion opened formal negotiations. This was their pattern. They weren't unreasonable. They simply operated from a position of total power and expected everyone else to acknowledge it. They had established, through 3 years of systematic war, that they were the dominant force in this region. They would extend an offer to the humans, probably territory or resource access or something. And if the humans were smart, they would acknowledge Vreth primacy and negotiate a position. The human fleet's response to the formal negotiation opening was to continue closing at intercept speed. The Vreth sent a second communication, more urgent. The translation came out as, "You are approaching our operational zone. Cease approach and identify your intentions." The human response, and I watched this come through the translation software in real time, because I'd slaved the communication feed to the sensor display, was 4 words. "Our intentions are obvious." And the human fleet crossed into engagement range. Now, I have to be very careful here because I'm not a military analyst, and what followed was unlike anything in my experience or training. I'm going to describe what I saw as accurately as I can, but I want you to understand that I was watching this on a sensor display, not through a window, and the events were moving faster than anything I'd ever tracked. The Vreth fleet opened fire first. That was tactically correct behavior. They were in contested space with an unidentified force that had declared hostile intent. They fired first with their forward batteries, a concentrated salvo designed to halt the human approach and create space for renegotiation. The human ships moved. I don't mean they turned or retreated. I mean the entire formation, all 22 vessels, moved in a coordinated pattern that the sensor software kept trying to classify as evasive maneuvering and kept failing at because it wasn't evasive maneuvering. Evasive maneuvering is reactive. What the humans did was different. They moved as if they had already known where the Vreth shots were going to be, as if the movement was part of a plan that had been drawn up before the first shot was fired. The Vreth salvo passed through empty space where the human fleet had just been. And then the humans fired. I've watched the sensor record of that first exchange probably 60 or 70 times over the years, and I still notice something new every time. The thing that strikes me most, the thing I keep coming back to, is the economy of it. The humans didn't fire wide suppression patterns the way most fleets did in an opening exchange. They didn't fire warning shots or demonstration salvos. Every single shot was targeted. Every shot was aimed at something specific: power systems, drive nodes, weapons emplacements. They were not trying to destroy the Vreth ships. They were trying to disable them. And they were doing it with a precision that suggested they had spent considerable time studying Vreth vessel architecture before showing up to this fight. 3 Vreth ships went dark in the first exchange. Not destroyed, just offline, tumbling in dead stick drift. The rest of the Vreth fleet spread out, changed formation, began the tactical adjustments that a competent military force makes when the first engagement doesn't go as expected. The humans followed them through every adjustment, not chasing, anticipating, moving to positions that cut off the Vreth fleet's best options before they could execute them. Dorvas said very quietly, "They've been watching Vreth tactics." "For how long?" I asked. "Long enough," he said. "Much longer than 3 years. The battle, if you can call it a battle, which I'm honestly not sure you can, because battle implies a contest between comparable forces, and what I was watching wasn't quite that, lasted approximately 4 hours. I say approximately because my perception of time during those 4 hours was not entirely reliable. I remember certain moments with extraordinary clarity and other stretches as a kind of blur, the way your memory edits traumatic or overwhelming experiences into the parts that your brain has decided matter most. What I remember clearly: about 40 minutes in, the Vreth fleet attempted a flanking maneuver, splitting into 2 groups, one to engage the human formation directly, one to swing around the asteroid field and hit from behind. It was a textbook flanking maneuver, the kind that had worked against Delvani forces multiple times in the past 3 years. The humans split their own fleet before the Vreth group had even fully committed to the maneuver. Half of them stayed on the primary formation, half of them swung wide, further than the Vreth's flanking group, cutting off the path before the Vreth ships could complete the arc. The Vreth flanking group found itself with nowhere to go. They turned back toward the main fleet. The human ships that had cut them off followed them, maintaining the tightest possible geometry, forcing the Vreth back into range of the human primary formation. 7 more Vreth ships went dark in that exchange. 3 of them tried to run, actually broke from formation and went for distance, and were disabled with what the sensor analysis described as targeted drive system precision strikes before they could build enough velocity to matter. The drives were disabled, the ships were not destroyed. I noticed that pattern holding throughout. 4 hours of engagement, and I could not confirm a single Vreth vessel destroyed. Disabled, yes. Heavily damaged in several cases. One had what appeared to be a hull breach in a non-critical section, but none of them were destroyed. Dorvas noticed it too. "They're not killing them," he said. "No," I agreed. "Why not?" I didn't have an answer to that, not then. I found out later, and I'll get to it. Around the 2-hour mark, the Vreth fleet commander, and this was, I learned afterward, an officer of very significant rank and reputation within the Dominion, opened a broad-spectrum communication channel, addressed it to the human fleet. The content, roughly translated, was, "Name your terms." The human response took about 30 seconds. Either someone was composing it carefully, or someone had to be found and consulted, or, and I suspect this was actually it, someone wanted the Vreth commander to sit with the question for a moment. The terms, when they came, were stated very simply. Full cessation of all Vreth military operations in the outer expanse. Withdrawal of all Vreth forces from Delvani space within 48 standard hours. Full accounting of all Delvani citizens taken in the course of military operations, with guaranteed right of repatriation. Reparations assessment to be conducted by neutral parties. Acknowledgement, in the formal galactic cooperative record, of unlawful aggression against a protected developing civilization. And then, after a pause, "These terms are not negotiable. You have 10 minutes to respond." On the sensor display, the remaining functional Vreth vessels, roughly 22 ships that still had drive power, out of the original 47, were surrounded. Not trapped exactly. There was space to move technically, but every viable direction was covered. If the Vreth fleet commander looked at his tactical display and ran the numbers, which he almost certainly did, within about 30 seconds, he would have seen that there was no good option. He could fight on. He had 22 ships against 22 human vessels that had just demonstrated they could consistently outmaneuver, outshoot, and outstrategize him. His losses would be significant, possibly total. He could run. Some of his ships might make it out of range before being disabled. Maybe, if the humans let them go, which was not guaranteed. Or he could accept the terms. It took 8 of the 10 minutes. The Vreth fleet commander accepted the terms. There was no announcement, no dramatic declaration of victory. The sensor displays just slowly over the next 20 minutes showed the Vreth fleet reconfiguring, not into a combat formation, not into a defensive spread, but into the geometry of a fleet preparing for transit. Turning, pointing their drives at the direction they'd come from. Going home. Commander Vel had been in contact with the human fleet throughout the second half of the engagement. I don't know exactly what was said. The communications were on a channel I didn't have access to, but I watched her face through the transparent panel of the command bay, and I watched it change. Slowly. The way something frozen changes when warmth gets to it, which is not a fast process, and not a comfortable one either, because the transition between frozen and thawed involves a kind of structural upheaval. She was crying by the time it was over. She would have been appalled to know that I saw that, and I never told her, not in all the years I knew her afterward. Some private moments deserve to stay that way. The human flagship, the largest of the 3 heavy vessels, which I later learned was called the Endurance, which felt like a very human name for a very human ship, came alongside the refuge about 3 hours after the Vreth fleet departed. They sent a shuttle over, small crew, 5 people in a vehicle that looked as functional and no-nonsense as everything else about them. I was in the docking bay when they arrived, partly because Commander Vel had asked me to be there as her translation liaison. My archive work had given me the best working knowledge of human cooperative communication protocols among the refuge's staff, and partly, honestly, because I needed to see them in person. After 4 hours of watching them through a sensor display, I needed to understand what they actually looked like. They were smaller than I expected. That sounds strange, given everything, but it's true. The readings had been so overwhelming, the fleet, the firepower, the tactical performance, that some part of my brain had built an image of something physically imposing, something that matched the scale of what they'd done. They were not physically imposing. They were medium-sized, bipedal, covered in a thin material that I understood was protective equipment. It wasn't their natural skin, which I could see on their faces and hands. The 5 of them varied considerably in appearance, which was something I'd read about humans but still found striking in person. 5 individuals from the same species, and they looked remarkably different from each other. Different heights, different colorings, different facial structures. But they moved the same. That was what I noticed first. All 5 of them moved with a kind of contained, steady assurance that had nothing to do with arrogance. It was something older than arrogance. Something that had been earned a long time ago, and had been living in their bodies ever since, so deep that they probably weren't even aware of it anymore. The one in front, the one who appeared to be in charge, though the hierarchy wasn't immediately obvious because humans don't tend to perform hierarchy the way most species do, was a woman with short gray-streaked hair and eyes that were a specific shade of dark brown that I remember very precisely even now, cycles later. She walked to the front of the delegation with the kind of unhurried pace that means you have nowhere to be in a hurry because you've already done what needed doing. She looked at Commander Vel. Then she looked around the docking bay, at the worn panels, the patched systems, the Delvani crew members standing in their battered equipment, the general texture of a place that had been holding together through 3 years of steadily failing hope. And something moved across her face that I had not expected. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't look satisfied. She looked like someone who had arrived somewhere they'd been trying to get to for a long time and found that the journey hadn't fully prepared them for what they'd find when they got there. She said something in human language, and my translation earpiece worked on it for a moment, and then it gave me the rendering. We got here as fast as we could. It was an apology, the simplest possible kind. No explanation, no justification, no rationale. Just the acknowledgement of the gap between when they'd come and when they should have come, and the weight of what had happened in that gap. Commander Vel stood very straight and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, in careful human-inflected cooperative standard, "You came, that's what matters now." Her name was Captain Adrian Kowalczyk. I'll give you the full name because she deserves the full name. She and Commander Vel talked for about 2 hours in the refuge's main conference space, which was nicer in theory than in practice, being a repurposed cargo bay with fold-down tables and a permanently malfunctioning temperature regulator that made one end of the room noticeably warmer than the other. I sat in as translator, though Kowalczyk spoke reasonable cooperative standard herself. 2 of her crew sat with her. A tall man named Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, who was the tactician who had planned the engagement, and a smaller, younger woman named Ensign Dara Huang, who was, as far as I could determine, the human fleet's expert on Delvani civilization specifically, which meant she had spent considerable time studying us. I found that detail extraordinary. The humans had someone whose specific expertise was the Delvani. They had anticipated needing to understand us before they arrived. I asked about this at one point when there was a natural pause in the conversation. I asked Ensign Huang directly, how long had she been studying Delvani culture? She said about 4 years. The war had started 3.5 years ago. Before I could fully process that, she added, we knew what the Vreth were planning before they made their move. The cooperative's monitoring of their fleet buildup was insufficient. Ours was less insufficient. She said with a very slight emphasis that I filed away to think about later. You've been building your own intelligence network, I said. We've been paying attention, she said, which was not a denial. Kowalczyk across the table said without looking up from the document she was reviewing, the cooperative quarantined us. They didn't say we couldn't look. Webb, who had said very little up to this point, said, we've been watching the Vreth for 11 years. We started building the response fleet 8 years ago. 8 years, when the Delvani were still cataloging stellar drift and atmospheric changes, and had not the faintest premonition that anything was coming. Why did it take you so long to arrive? Commander Vel asked. The question was even, not accusing, but it was the question that needed asking. Kowalczyk looked up. The cooperative, she said simply. They were aware we were building a response capability. They were not enthusiastic. There were diplomatic obstacles, legal challenges, the quarantine status, the assessment process. She paused. We were not supposed to engage in military operations outside our own space. Several cooperative member worlds made that very clear. They tried to stop you? Vel asked. They tried to slow us down, Kowalczyk said. There's a difference. Stopping us would have required resources they didn't have or weren't willing to deploy. Slowing us down, she glanced at Webb, took 13 months longer than it should have. 13 months. I did not say out loud what I was thinking about those 13 months, which was that approximately 4 million Delvani had died in them. I think Kowalczyk knew what I was thinking. The apology she'd offered in the docking bay expanded in that moment, in the silence, to cover all of it. I'm going to tell you about one conversation that happened on the second day of the human presence at the refuge. Not a big conversation, not a diplomatic one. A small one, which is why it matters. Ensign Dara Huang was walking one of the refuge's main corridors, getting her bearings, I think, familiarizing herself with the layout, when she came around a corner and nearly walked into Cell. Cell, the 4-year-old, Cell with her Star Sounds toy. I was about 20 feet behind Huang, doing my translation liaison thing, following at a polite distance while she explored. I watched the encounter. Cell looked up at Huang, enormous dark eyes doing their assessment, the toy clutched in both hands. Huang crouched down to eye level immediately. Not slowly, not with the kind of careful deliberateness of someone approaching an uncertain animal. Just immediately, naturally, the way someone does when they've been around small children enough that it's automatic. She said something in a low voice. I couldn't hear it clearly enough for the earpiece to translate, but the tone was unmistakable. The soft, direct, entirely sincere register that most species across the galaxy use when speaking to children, which is maybe the most universal thing there is. Cell studied her for a long moment. Then Cell held out the Star Sounds toy. If you don't understand why that hit me so hard, let me explain. Cell had stopped showing people her toy 2 days before the humans arrived. She'd pulled into herself, gone quiet, stopped sharing the small, bright thing she cared about. She'd read the emotional temperature of the base correctly and responded to it the way children respond to fear, by protecting the things that mattered most. And now she was holding the toy out to this stranger, this human woman she'd never seen before. Huang took the toy carefully. She turned it over in her hands, looking at it with what seemed like genuine interest. She pressed the button that played the star sounds, the low, harmonic, stretched-out recordings of stellar vibrations that Delvani children were given, because it connected them to the deep-time work that their civilization had always done, and she listened. Her expression changed while she listened. I couldn't fully read it, because human facial expressions were still somewhat new to me, but the closest I can describe it is this. She looked like someone hearing something that reminded them of something else, something they couldn't quite name from very far away. She said something to Cell. My earpiece caught it this time. That's the most beautiful thing I've heard in a long time. Cell took the toy back, examined Huang's face the way she examined everything she decided was worth examining. And I watched this. I promise you I watched this, she smiled. 4-year-old Cell had not smiled in 2 days. I had to go around a corner for a moment. I have never fully explained why to anyone who asked. Over the next week, the human fleet moved from the engagement zone to a holding position near the refuge, and the process of dealing with the aftermath began. Aftermath is an interesting word. It suggests something comes after something else, which is technically accurate but misses the way that aftermath is actually an ongoing event rather than a discrete moment. The things that come after war are not tidy. They don't resolve cleanly. They have layers. The first layer was the logistics. 25 Vreth ships had been disabled in the engagement. The remaining 22 had departed with the fleet, but the disabled ones were drifting through the system like enormous, expensive, suddenly very helpless pieces of evidence. The humans handled this with methodical efficiency, sending boarding teams to secure each vessel, ensure the crews were unharmed. They were, all of them, because the human targeting had been very precise about not putting them in physical danger, and provide basic life support stabilization where needed. This was, I should note, not a process that anyone had asked the humans to undertake. Commander Vell had been prepared to leave the disabled Vreth ships where they were until a cooperative recovery team could be organized. The humans had simply begun the process, informing Vell's command as a courtesy, as if it were self-evident that when people were stuck in a disabled ship drifting in space, you went and helped them, including the people who had just spent 4 years trying to destroy your clients. I spent some time thinking about that, the dissonance of it. The humans had arrived with a level of tactical ferocity that had made everyone on the refuge go very quiet and very still while they watched the engagement. And they had done that engagement with extraordinary care about not killing anyone. And then immediately afterward they had gone to help the people they'd just beaten. I asked Webb about it. He was the tactician. I thought he might give me the clearest answer about the targeting approach. He thought about it for a moment before he answered. He was someone who clearly considered his words before speaking, which I appreciated. We've done a lot of killing, he said, as a species. More than you probably know, we have a long, long history of it. He paused. At some point, somewhere along the way, some of us decided that if you could accomplish the objective without killing, you were obligated to try. Some of you, I said. Yes, he agreed. Some of us. It's ongoing. It's not universal. We're not. He paused again. We're not good as a species. In some fundamental way, I mean, we're complicated. We have this capacity for violence that we can't quite get rid of, and this capacity for care that we also can't quite get rid of, and they exist in the same creatures at the same time, and we've never fully figured out what to do with that. And today, I asked, in this engagement, he looked at the display showing the Vreth vessel recovery operation. Today we tried to be the second thing. The formal accounting came through on the 5th day. The Vreth Dominion had, over the course of the 3-year war, relocated approximately 11 million Delvani citizens from the occupied worlds. Relocated was the Vreth term. What it actually meant in practice was that they had transported those 11 million people to labor facilities in various parts of Vreth-controlled space, where they had been working in conditions that the human recovery teams, when they eventually accessed those facilities, described in their official reports with language that was professionally measured and clinically accurate and still managed to convey, in every line, an absolute fury. The negotiated terms required full repatriation. Getting 11 million people back from Vreth-controlled facilities was not a fast process. I'll just tell you the final number, it took 4 years. 4 more years of negotiation, logistics, legal action through the cooperative's arbitration mechanisms, and the kind of sustained, patient pressure that the human diplomatic teams turned out to be extraordinarily good at. Different from their military capability, but related to it somehow, the same fundamental quality expressed in a different register. Not everyone came back. Some had died in the facilities. Some had been moved through enough intermediary systems that tracking them was genuinely impossible. Some, and this was the hardest category, the one that nobody wanted to talk about, but everyone had to. Some didn't want to be called displaced persons anymore, had built new lives in the chaos, and the question of who they were now was something that the repatriation process couldn't easily answer. The deaths in the facilities, 740,000. I want to put that number here because it deserves to be said clearly. 740,000 people who were alive when the Vreth began their campaign and were not alive when the accounting was done. The Delvani reparations process, when the cooperative finally established its neutral assessment body, produced a figure that I won't reproduce here because it's in the formal record, and also because numbers of that size become abstract in a way that 740,000 specific individual people do not. The Vreth paid, not quickly, not without protest, not without 3 separate legal challenges that were all rejected by the cooperative arbitration body. But they paid, and the formal acknowledgement of unlawful aggression went into the cooperative record, where it remains. I checked, it's still there. Something else happened in that 5th-day period that I want to tell you about, because it shapes the rest of what I'm going to say. The Galactic Cooperative sent a formal communication to the human fleet, a diplomatic dispatch from the Central Chamber. I wasn't in the room when it arrived, but Captain Kowalczyk shared its contents with Commander Vel, and Vel shared them with her senior staff. And by that evening, the substance of it was known throughout the refuge the way all significant information travels through a small, enclosed community, by the specific gravity of it pulling people's conversations in a particular direction. The cooperative's message was, in essence, this. The human fleet had acted in violation of the quarantine protocol and the terms of the ongoing assessment process. The unauthorized military operation in the outer expanse represented a significant breach of agreed parameters. The cooperative took this very seriously. The cooperative expected the human fleet to stand down and return to their designated space immediately. The assessment process would need to be reviewed in light of these events. It was a formal reprimand, from the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy to a species that had just prevented the extinction of a civilization. The human fleet's response was, and I mean this literally, I have seen the actual text of the response. Ensign Huang showed me a copy because she found it personally satisfying, 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph acknowledged receipt of the communication and expressed appropriate formal respect for the cooperative's role as the governing body of the known galaxy. The second paragraph noted that the human fleet had reviewed the specific provisions of the quarantine protocol and the assessment parameters, and had determined that none of those provisions included language that explicitly prohibited intervention in cases of active genocide of a member people, a gap which the humans respectfully suggested the cooperative's legal team might want to address in future assessments. The third paragraph said that the human fleet would be happy to discuss the matter further at the cooperative's convenience, and in the meantime intended to remain in the outer expanse to assist with the stabilization of the Delvani remnant and ensure the terms of the Vreth cessation agreement were being honored, as no other party appeared to be doing so. It was signed by Captain Adrian Kowalczyk and countersigned by something designated as the Terran Expeditionary Response Force Command Authority, which I later learned was a very new institution that humans had created specifically for this kind of operation, and which was not, as yet, recognized by the cooperative in any formal capacity. The cooperative did not respond immediately. When they did respond, several weeks later, the tone was somewhat different from the initial reprimand. The humans, it seemed, had caused a particular kind of problem for the cooperative's political architecture that was very difficult to manage, which was the problem of having done something conspicuously right in a situation where the cooperative had done nothing at all. I want to jump forward slightly. Not to the end of the whole story, there's more. And I'm going to tell it, but forward a few weeks, to a specific conversation I had with Captain Kowalczyk that I've thought about more than almost any other single exchange in my life. It was late in what the refuge kept as its night cycle. Most of the crew and the human liaison teams were sleeping. I was in the observation bay because I had developed a habit of going there when I couldn't sleep, which had been often during the war and continued to be often in its immediate aftermath. The observation bay was a small room with a large, transparent panel looking out into the void, and sitting in front of it had this quality of making the internal noise in your head slightly less overwhelming, because the scale of what you were looking at put the internal noise in a different perspective. Kowalczyk was already there when I arrived. She was sitting in the secondary chair, not looking at the void, but at a small device in her hands. A photograph, I realized, the physical print kind that humans apparently still produced in significant numbers despite having other options, because they had a thing about objects you could hold. She looked up when I came in. She didn't say anything, just nodded in a way that meant come in if you want. I sat in the primary chair and looked at the void for a while. Eventually I said, "What is that?" She held up the photograph. It was of a group of people, humans, but not in military equipment. Casual clothing outdoors, standing in what appeared to be strong sunlight on a green surface. They were all looking at the camera except one young man in the back who was looking at something off to the side with an expression I couldn't read from the angle and resolution. "My family," she said, "or most of it." I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure what was called for. She said, "I have a daughter. She's 23 now. She was 15 when I took this assignment." She paused. She asked me why I was going, not in an angry way. She was old enough to understand, mostly. But she asked, "What did you say?" Kowalczyk was quiet for a moment, looking at the photograph. I told her that there were people who were about to run out of time, and that we had the ability to make sure they didn't, and that if we had that ability and didn't use it, then what we were building, everything we were trying to be, everything we kept telling ourselves humans were becoming, was a lie. She put the photograph down on her knee. She told me I was going to miss her birthday. "Did you?" "3 of them," she said. I looked at the void through the observation panel. The distant smear of a nebula, the faint patterns of deep stellar current. The beauty that was always out there regardless of what was happening in any particular corner of it. "There's a child on this base," I said. "Cell, she's 4 cycles old. She showed you her toy." "I remember her," Kowalczyk said immediately. "She'd stopped showing people her toy," I said. "During the last few days before you arrived, she'd stopped because," I stopped, tried again. "The atmosphere here was such that she could feel that things were ending, and she responded by protecting the things that mattered to her, keeping them private." Kowalczyk was watching me. She had this quality in conversation of being entirely present in a way that I noticed because it was rarer than it should be in people of responsibility and power. Like she was actually here in this conversation, rather than in 3 other conversations at once. "She showed you her toy," I said, "the second day. She decided you were safe." Kowalczyk looked at the photograph in her hands. Her daughter, somewhere far from here, who had missed 3 birthdays because her mother had decided she couldn't look away. "Good," she said very quietly. "I'm glad." Part 5, the thing that came after. Here's something about the Delvani that I should have mentioned earlier. We are an old species, and old species accumulate things. Not just physical objects, though there's plenty of that, but frameworks. Ways of understanding the universe that have been built up over so many cycles that they've become invisible. The way the thing you've been standing on for long enough stops feeling like it's under your feet and just feels like the floor. One of our frameworks was about what we called the calculus of value. It wasn't formal doctrine, not written down anywhere as such, but it was woven through our literature, our philosophical tradition, our education. The idea was this: a civilization's worth could be read in how it treated the less powerful. Not the less powerful who were similar to it, or who it had a formal relationship with, or who might be useful to it someday. The genuinely less powerful, the ones with nothing to offer. The ones for whom helping would cost you something real. We had articulated this principle beautifully over centuries. It appeared in our poetry. It was cited in our diplomatic documents. It was the kind of idea that a Delvani philosopher could elaborate on for 3 hours and leave the audience feeling genuinely moved. And then the breath came, and the cooperative watched. and we discovered that our beautiful principle was, for us, mostly aesthetic, a way of feeling good about ourselves. The test came and we had no weapons and no ability to enforce it and nothing to offer anyone, and the species who turned up with weapons and the demonstrated willingness to use them were the ones who'd been quarantined for being dangerously unhinged. I am not saying this to be self-critical in a general way. I am saying it because it taught me something very specific about the relationship between principles and actions, between articulated values and lived ones. The humans were not philosophical about what they did. They didn't have 3 centuries of literature on the calculus of value. They were not, by most measures, a gentle civilization. They had done terrible things to each other, extensively, throughout their history, and some of them were still doing terrible things and probably would keep doing so for a long time. But when the moment came, when there was a civilization at the end of everything with nothing to offer at the edge of the galaxy where no one important was watching, the humans showed up. Not because it was strategically useful, not because the Delvani were allied with them, not because the cooperative was asking them to, which it emphatically was not. They showed up because they decided to. Because someone, somewhere in their complicated, violent, remarkable species, had looked at the situation and said, "We can do something about this, and so we will." The Delvani are rebuilding. That process has been going on for about 40 cycles now, and it will continue for a long time. Our occupied worlds were returned, a process that took 6 years of sustained diplomatic and legal work, most of which was done by a combination of the cooperative's newly energized enforcement arm and the quiet but very present pressure of the Terran Response Force, who had long since been formally recognized by the cooperative as a provisional military partner, largely because trying to unrecognize them had proven politically impossible. The Pellucid vein, the resource deposit that started all of this, became the subject of a multilateral mining agreement under cooperative supervision. The Delvani receive a percentage of proceeds. It's complicated and imperfect, and there are ongoing arguments about the terms every 3 cycles like clockwork. It's better than what the Vreth had planned. The Vreth Dominion is still a functioning political entity. This bothers some people, and I understand why, but the alternative, punishing an entire civilization for the actions of its military government, had precedents that nobody in the cooperative wanted to establish. The government that planned the Delvani campaign was removed from power by internal political upheaval within a few years of the settlement. Whether the new government is genuinely different is a matter of ongoing debate. 740,000 people are still dead. I think about that number, I always will. Commander Vel retired about 20 cycles after the conflict ended. She lives now on Telvari's second moon, Telvari having been rebuilt enough to make its moon habitable again, which was a project that took 15 years and multiple rounds of cooperative infrastructure assistance. She keeps a garden, apparently. I have received 4 letters from her over the cycles, which is 4 more than most people send. The last one mentioned that she had recently met, at a diplomatic reception, a delegation from the Terran Expeditionary Authority, the successor to the Response Force, now a fully recognized cooperative institution. She said one of the delegates had brought their child, a small human girl, about the same age Cell had been. Vel said the child had shown her a toy. Vel said she had stood there holding it and had not known what to say for a long moment. Then she'd handed it back and told the girl it was beautiful. I read that letter 3 times before I put it down. I am going to tell you about the last day of the initial human presence at the refuge, because it is where the story ends for me, where my version of it ends anyway. The fleet had been there for about 3 weeks. The immediate stabilization was complete. The Vreth cessation was holding. The repatriation process had been formally initiated. The first cooperative relief ships were arriving. The humans were preparing to rotate part of their fleet, not leave, not yet, but begin the transition from emergency response to sustained presence. The morning of that last day, the entire complement of the refuge, all 800 people, gathered in the main assembly bay. This was not a planned event. It started because someone suggested it and word spread and people just came. The way things happen in small communities when the need is real. Captain Kowalczyk was there with her crew. Most of the refuge staff was there. People were standing in the kinds of informal configurations that happen when a group is too large for a room and just keeps packing in. No one had prepared a speech. There wasn't a program. Commander Vel stood at the front, and she looked at Kowalczyk, and she said something I am going to quote as accurately as I can, because I have kept the memory of it deliberately, the way you keep something you know you'll need again. She said I was going to prepare something formal, something that captured what this meant properly. She paused. I couldn't find the words, not because there aren't any, but because the words I know aren't, they're not quite right. They're from before, and I think we are all now from after. She looked around the bay, 800 people, 42-ship crews. The youngest people and the oldest. The ones who had been fighting for 3 years and the ones who had been trying to do their archive work and had ended up in the middle of something they had no framework for. You came, she said, to Kowalczyk and her crew and the fleet waiting outside. When we had no reason left to believe anyone would, you came and you were. She stopped, and I saw her searching for the word, and I saw her find it. You were enough. Kowalczyk stood in the middle of the bay with her crew around her, and her dark brown eyes were doing something that I understood by then. Was what human eyes did when the person behind them was trying to hold something very large, very still inside themselves. She said, we were late. Yes, Vel said. But you came. I want to end with Cell. She's 46 cycles now, by Delvani reckoning. She's a diplomat, which nobody could have predicted when she was 4 years old wandering the corridors of the refuge with her toy, but here we are. She specializes in Terran-Delvani relations specifically, which also did not surprise me in the least when I found out. She told me once, this was at a conference about 10 cycles ago, we ended up at the same table at the evening event, that she remembered the human fleet arriving. She had been too young to understand what it meant, but she remembered the feeling in the base changing. The particular quality of the air, the sounds people made, the way the adults around her shifted from one posture to another posture over the course of a few hours. She said she didn't fully understand until she was older and could read the records. She said, what strikes me most is that they didn't have to come. Not legally, not strategically, not practically. The cooperative had effectively told them not to. There was no mechanism that required them to be there. They just, she paused, held her glass. They decided the situation was unacceptable and they came. I said, is that what strikes you most? She thought about it. No, she said after a moment. What strikes me most is that they were angry. When they arrived, they were genuinely, deeply angry, not performing it, not using it as a strategy. You can read it in the communications, in the tactical briefings. In the way they fought, careful enough to not kill anyone, but absolutely without quarter, without hesitation. They were furious at what had been done to people they'd never met. She turned her glass in her hands. I think that's what saved us, she said. Not just the ships, not just the weapons, the fact that they cared, that it mattered to them personally that we were dying, that they felt it. She looked at me. What kind of species, she said, maintains that capacity across all the years they've spent hurting each other? I didn't have an answer, I still don't. But I think the question itself is part of the answer. Epilogue, what I carry. I'm old now by Delvani reckoning. My secondary sensory filaments have gone mostly gray, which is our version of showing our years. I am still a keeper of records. It is still what I am good at, still what I was made to do, in the deep sense of the word made that has nothing to do with physical construction and everything to do with the shape of a life. I keep records. I archive. I try to preserve things accurately so that the future can know the past as clearly as the past will allow. I've been asked, many times, why I chose to write this account in the first person rather than the standard third-person archival format that Delvani scholars use. Why I put myself in it. Why I let it be messy and personal and specific rather than clean and official and distanced. The answer is that I was there. I was in the sensor bay when those drive signatures came in. I was in the docking bay when the shuttle landed. I sat in the observation room with Kowalczyk and looked at the void. I watched Cell hold out her toy. A record that doesn't contain those things would be accurate in the technical sense and incomplete in the important one. And also, I will be honest with you, I keep writing it because I need to. Because there is something about that period that demands to be told by the people who lived through it, not just cataloged. The dead deserve to be represented by more than numbers. The living who survived deserve to have the shape of their survival honored. And the humans, the complicated, violent, furious, caring, imperfect, remarkable humans, deserve to have someone say clearly and without ambiguity what they did and why it mattered. They came when we had no reason left to believe anyone would. They were late, yes. They were later than they should have been, and the space between when they should have come and when they did come is filled with real loss that nothing can undo. But they came. They looked at a situation at the edge of the galaxy where nobody important was watching, and nobody was asking them to, and the formal governing structures of the known civilized world had determined it was too complicated to address. They looked at all of that, and they decided it was unacceptable. They built a fleet in secret, over 8 years. They fought through diplomatic obstacles and legal challenges and the sustained opposition of a governing body that vastly outnumbered and outweighed them. They trained and prepared and waited for the moment when they could go, and when the moment came, they went. They were angry and they were careful, and they were tired from years of preparation, and they were exactly enough. And in the moment when the last hope was running out, when Commander Vell was making the calculation of which ships to load with civilians and which to send into a final fight they couldn't win, the sensor boards lit up, and the drive signatures came in, and Dorvas looked at me and I looked at him, and the readings were something we had no category for.